Hi, friends. Welcome back to this edition of Welcome to Tradition, a series of interviews between myself and my friend here, Jim DePiante, on matters that are going to be of particular interest to Catholics who are new to tradition, new to the traditional Mass, or if you have been attending the traditional Mass for some time, there may be things you've noticed and wondered about, didn't know who to ask or how to ask it. And so we're covering those kinds of things. Hopefully you'll find this journey to be an enlightening one. Jim, welcome to the call.
Thank you. Thank you kindly.
So this is episode number 4. We've covered a lot of ground already. Just a quick review, some things that we've covered in past weeks, basic principles and guidelines for gestures and postures within the liturgy, how and when to strike your breast, how and when to make the sign of the cross, and to hold your hands, and how and when to genuflect, even how to sit. And yes, these things really do matter. And we've covered why the liturgy is a different human activity than just the casual way we go about our lives. We talked about the error of primitivism and the sin of singularity, and why it's important to have uniformity in not just our belief. We probably all think about the importance of that in an age of apostasy and heresy, but also the importance of uniformity in terms of how we worship. Now, we're going to go into more detail on a few of these issues when we start to talk about the different Mass settings that you might find in things like low Mass and high Mass, because there are differences in what to do and when to do it based on the Mass. That's probably more than you're ready to hear from us today, but rest assured, I know some of you have those questions because you've already shared them. You've gone to a low Mass and you were kneeling at one time, you went to a high Mass and you found everybody else was standing and you thought, what's happening? We'll get to that. But before we get into all that, one of the topics that I wanted to cover, because anybody who's gone to more than one Mass will discover that there is something different between the low Mass, sometimes referred to in some circles as a dialogue Mass, and a high Mass, and a Missa cantata, and a solemn Mass. So Jim, we're going to start off at a fast pace today. What are the difference between all of these Masses?
All right, it's a good place to start. So probably one of the most important things to observe is that the liturgy is intended to be sung, whether that be the divine office or the Mass, which are the two principal elements of the liturgy. Why is that? Well, we glorify God as we sing. The Mass was typed. So the type for the Mass in the Old Testament was the temple service, and that was sung. So you had the supreme pontiff of the temple, who was the high priest, who is a type essentially for our Pope, conducting a service in the temple that was sung. He sang, and then the priests and Levites also sang. It's fairly well known that St. Augustine said, it's in a typical pithy little Latin axiom, and it's got a nice little rhyme to it: qui cantat bis orat, qui cantat bis orat. And that means who sings twice prays. And that's often rendered he who sings well, prays twice. But really, he only said, he who sings prays twice. If you consider that the liturgy is intended to be sung, and maybe another way to look at that is you're only doing what is the default if you sing the liturgy. So if you're only reciting the liturgy, you're actually doing half of what should be intended. So the liturgy, and principally the Mass and the divine office, are intended to be sung, led, of course, by the priest. Back in the very beginning, the normative Mass was the Pontifical Mass. And this, as I said, was based on the temple service. Now, when you hear Pontifical Mass, in Latin, Missa Pontificalis, you hear the word pontifical, and your immediate reaction typically is to think, well, this involves the Pope. It actually can, but it needn't. In fact, I recall a friend going to a pontifical mass and thinking that somehow the priest would be at this little village mass in Italy, but turned out not to be the case. So every bishop is a pontiff. When we refer to the Pope, we refer to him as either the Supreme Pontiff or the Roman Pontiff. So Pontifical Mass is a Mass said by a bishop. It's not a papal Mass. A very special Pontifical Mass where the Pope presides, where the Pope is the celebrant, is called a Missa Papalis, a papal Mass. It's the most elaborate form of the Mass. So every Missa Papalis is necessarily a Missa Pontificalis because he's a bishop, but not every Missa Pontificalis is a Missa Papalis. So in a Pontifical Mass, the celebrant is a bishop, any bishop. The distinguishing characteristic of the Missa Pontificalis, the Pontifical Mass, is the use of sacred ministers. So in addition to the bishop, you have what are liturgically, ceremoniously referred to as a deacon and subdeacon. It could actually be two priests, or it could be a priest and a deacon, or it could be two deacons. But they're referred to in the liturgy as sacred ministers, deacon and subdeacon. The bishop, as celebrant, sings all parts of the Mass, and another distinguishing characteristic of it is the use of incense. All the parts of the Mass are sung either by the bishop as celebrant or by a schola cantorum. Now, schola cantorum literally means a school of singers, a singing school, but it has nothing to do with a school in the sense of a place of learning. It's more akin to the word school as it's used in a school of fish. So schola cantorum is a group of singers, and they sing from a place in the church that is often enough referred to as the chancel. It's behind the communion rail within the sanctuary, typically in benches that face each other. That part of the church building is referred to as the choir. And those who sing from there sing from in choir. And they came to be known as the choir. So papal Mass is the most elaborate expression of the Pontifical Mass. The Pontifical Mass characterized by all parts are sung either by the celebrant or a schola cantorum, the use of incense, and the presence of sacred ministers, deacon and subdeacon, to assist the celebrant at the Mass.
I love this expression that you cited from St. Augustine. I think if we return to that, one who sings prays twice effectively. If you think about it, it's very easy for us to talk. It's very easy for us even to recite verbatim prayers or oaths or other things that we're accustomed to saying on a regular basis. It's much more difficult for us to sing, let alone to sing well. It just requires a lot more effort. More of the body is involved, and it requires more concentration. And so I think if you see in that kind of what St. Augustine was getting to, that there's a greater devotion of our will,
of ourselves, of our will, of our intellect, of our bodies. I mean, singing is sort of it's the most wondrous thing that we can do with our voices. And that's why things like opera exist, because you take all the drama of a play and now you sing it, and now you have all that expression, but in a much more sophisticated way.
I know some philosophers have said that the creation of music, or the expression of music, is it's like the closest human activity to divine creation, which that's probably not a theological statement we should reflect on, but that gives them some sense of how
beautiful sentiment.
Yeah. What about the person who says, well, I'm not a good singer, and so by singing and I'm out of key and or I'm out of tune, I'm off key, and all this sort of stuff, I'm actually not doing anything good because I'm such a bad singer. What would you say to that person?
I would say that
other than to practice.
Well, do as well as you can, but like every other human characteristic, there's a wide distribution of capability. But if you consider the greatest human singers, none of them can sing in anything that even modestly approaches the way the angels would sing. And the angels sing. Principally, they sing, oh, we're in Lent. I'm not even supposed to say it. They sing Hallelujah. That's what they sing. That's what the angels sing. So it's just a question of degree. We all sing fairly badly, some less badly than others, but that's not the point. The point is when we sing, we are worshiping with our voices in the most elegant way that we can use our voices, even if it's not refined, even if it's not perfect. And so we do the best we can, but God's not going to turn anybody away because they don't sing like Andrea Bocelli.
And if you've got that sense that you're not a very good singer, if you're hesitant to be singing in the liturgy, maybe that's your guardian angel pricking your conscience to say, hey, you need to work on this a little bit, right? You need
to listen to some music. That's the most important thing you can do to learn how to sing. Listen to music, listen to Gregorian chant, and you will sing better, guaranteed.
Yeah. Okay, so you went through a great explanation of the Pontifical Mass, and forgive me if you already said this, but the word pontiff, I think you alluded to it. The word pontiff actually means high priest. And so when we're talking about the bishop, it's kind of interesting to remember, for Catholics, we're so Roman centered and everybody thinks about the Pope all the time, but your bishop is a kind of a little pope in his diocese.
He is, absolutely. He's a pontiff within his diocese. The root word from Latin means a bridge builder, ponte, pontiff. So a bridge between each of us and the church and God. In fact, the Pope of Rome, the Roman pontiff, is not the only pope. There are patriarchs of other particular churches who are referred to as popes. Absolutely. But every bishop is a pontiff. The Bishop of Rome is the Roman pontiff and the supreme pontiff.
Absolutely. Okay, so thank you for all those distinctions. Now, most everywhere Catholics who are listening to this live, the masses that are commonly said are not going to be said by their bishop. Even on Sundays or holy days, it would be rare for a Catholic to witness the mass of a bishop. So where does that leave us in terms of the everyday experience that Catholics are going to have in a liturgy?
Well, of course, most masses are not said by a bishop. Some several hundred years into the church's history, it became very clear that more masses needed to be said than could be said by bishops. And so we encountered what I'm going to characterize as the first derogation, in which simple priests, men who did not have the fullness of orders and who didn't govern a diocese, were permitted to say the same mass in place of a bishop. And so it has the same characteristics, makes use of sacred ministers, all the parts are sung, there's a schola cantorum, there's the use of incense. This mass is referred to as a Missa Solemnis, or a solemn mass.
And there are some other aspects that are some solemn mass. I just want to review that real quickly. The sacred ministers, all the parts are sung, the schola, the incense, and so we call it a Missa Solemnis. But there are going to be some occasions when there isn't incense, right? Is there ever a case in this kind of mass where there isn't incense?
You know, Jeff, I really don't know.
Okay.
We can look into that.
Maybe because I think we got this question in a group, and it may be possible that someone thought they were witnessing one thing and really they were witnessing another. So the Missa Solemnis requires 3 ordained clerics, 1 priest and 2 others. Could you tell us more about that and where that fits in in kind of this sliding scale that we're working on of masses?
Okay, so the idea that you can produce 3 priests to say, or a priest and 2 deacons to say this Missa Solemnis wasn't always possible. And that led to our next derogation. And this didn't come about actually until the Middle Ages. As the faith grew, the number of masses that needed to be said multiplied, there were certainly more faithful, but this is very interesting. There were also more priests. And so the real need for something less than this full-on solemn mass with priest, deacon, and subdeacon came about because there were, what a problem to have, so many priests, they each had to say a mass. And so they said their own mass with just a helper, and this helper was sort of the antecedent to the altar boy. There was no singing, no incense, and it was called a Missa Privata. And that literally means private mass, but it doesn't mean what we think it means. It means essentially, privata means it's related to the word deprived. So a Missa Privata was sort of a lessened mass. There was less to it because it wasn't sung, there was no incense, and there were no sacred ministers. And it was possible for a congregation to attend. Terminology changes, meaning shifts. It came to be known as a missa lecta, L-E-C-T-A, a read in the sense of reading, or a recited mass. And so none of this mass is sung, it's all recited, missa lecta.
You would be, based on the Latin expression that we're looking at here, privata. It's not so much private mass, but you would almost be of the school of, this is a mass of deprivation, where we don't have all of those things.
That is the absolute clear intent of the meaning Missa Privata. It's deprived of some of the ceremony, and not private in the sense of hidden from the general public. You can see the words are related, but it came to mean something different.
Right. And so today, we've got the opposite situation of what they had in medieval times, for example, where they had so many priests, and you had 6 or 8 side altars in a church, and you had priests saying these Missa Privatas all the time. Now we have a deprivation of priests, and so we're
priests, right?
And so we're back to that condition in many places where the Missa Privata is the standard,
is the default, right? Because that's the most we can hope for. We're thrilled to even get one priest to show up on a Sunday to say mass for us. Yeah.
And of course, let alone the solemn masses having deacons and subdeacons. Obviously, that's right. So let me ask you a question about that. A lot of people who've attended both masses, especially if you're new, maybe you've gone to the low mass, and then all of a sudden you have a missa cantata, and it's wonderful and it's beautiful and you love it. But there's something about the silence of that low mass that also has allowed the spiritual hunger of people to grow, and they come to love the opportunity for some meditation, perhaps even contemplation during the liturgy, because of the silence, right? So their zeal is growing within the silence. Whereas if you're in the pew, and let's face it, you're bombarded with the music, the singing of people all around you, sometimes you're kind of swept up in that experience, as opposed to, what's possible in silence. And people begin even to prefer that Missa Privata. What would you say to them?
I would say that I think that this was all part of what God had in mind. I mean, God made us all different. And some of us, I sing, I love singing at Mass. But I also understand that there are people who gain tremendous value from the opportunity to reflect, to meditate, to contemplate during a very, very quiet Mass. And like I said, I'm sure that God made us different, and the path that all this has taken in history was well known to him. And so I think he has given us those opportunities, and it's typical enough to find both possibilities wherever you're going to Mass. So I think folks are different, and God provides a way for each of them to worship him.
So even we can still pleasure in our gratitude, really, for having Mass, even if it's a low Mass.
Even if it is, yeah.
And there's an opportunity for us to grow perhaps in a different way. In the Missa Cantata, we might be exercising the opportunity to improve our singing, and what St. Augustine said about that in the low Mass, it's a different kind of opportunity for growth. Certainly there's a place for both of those. So we've talked about the Missa Pontificalis, the Missa Solemnis, the Missa Lecta. Most people on a week-to-week basis, they're not using those terms. They're talking about they're talking about high mass and low mass.
Right.
And there's a term that we've left out that we haven't used yet. Maybe we're going to get to it.
We're going to get to it.
All right. So I won't jump ahead of you. All right. So low mass and high mass, how does that fit within these others that we've already talked about?
All right. So sort of at the very top, we have Missa Pontificalis with the bishop, and it's properly known in English as a Pontifical Mass. The first derogation, we have the Missa Solemnis with a simple priest instead of a bishop. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same, properly known in English as a solemn Mass. These are both sung with sacred ministers and incense. They both can be collectively known as a high Mass or a solemn high Mass. There's a little bit of a fly in the ointment, though, which we're going to get to in a minute. Next, down the line in terms of derogation, we have the Missa Lecta. There's no singing, no sacred ministers, only altar servers, no incense. Now, it's properly known as Missa Lecta, a Mass that's read, not sung, formerly known as Missa Privata, but it's colloquially known in English as a low Mass. That's pretty good. It does introduce an ambiguity, which we're going to get to in just a second. But we have this distinction: high Mass, which certainly encompasses Missa Pontificalis and Missa Solemnis, and low Mass, which encompasses the Missa Lecta or Missa Privata.
What about a Mass, a so-called sung Mass that has incense, but without those sacred ministers? It does not have the deacon or the subdeacon.
All right, so this is sort of a hybrid, right? It's actually a low Mass, but it's sung, right? And so we have this derogation from Pontificalis to Solemnis to Lecta, and now we actually have gain of function. So rather than a derogation, we have gain of function officially. This is called a Missa Cantata Sine Ministris, a sung Mass without ministers, because typically a sung Mass has ministers. So the distinction is made: this is a Missa Cantata Sine Ministris, without ministers, or more simply, Missa Cantata, sung Mass, no ministers, and no incense. It came into being in the mid-1700s for use in the missions. So prior to that, Mass was either Pontificalis, Solemnis, or Lecta, and now we have this new thing, this hybrid, a low Mass, sung, but without ministers and without incense.
I can imagine the people listening right now, there's going to be a lot of confusion going on, because the Mass you've just described, the Missa Cantata, which is probably the more common liturgy on Sundays and holy days that traditional Catholics, they're going to be expecting and enjoying. That's also commonly called a high Mass. Commonly called a high Mass. You're saying it's actually a low Mass. Actually a low Mass. Okay.
Jeff, you're making problems for me, Jeff. All right. So in fact, not everyone calls it a high Mass. Most of the people you and I know call it a high Mass, but that's mainly a US thing. Why is that? Back in 1884, the Third Plenary Council of Baltimore published the ceremonial for the use of the Catholic churches in the United States of America, commonly referred to as the Baltimore Ceremonial. Same guys who published the Baltimore Catechism. Why is that? Because that was the first diocese that was the diocese of the colonies and the diocese of the early United States. So they published the Baltimore Catechism and also this thing called the Baltimore Ceremonial. And in that publication, we encounter this neologism, this new term called a high Mass without deacon or subdeacon. But strictly speaking, it's a Missa Cantatis, or Missa Cantatis Missa Cantata Sine Ministris, a sung Mass without ministers. So they call it a high Mass without deacon or subdeacon. All right. Strictly speaking, a sung Mass is a low Mass, and you see That creates a problem. That creates an ambiguity. So strictly speaking, Missa Pontificalis and Missa Solemnis are only correctly termed high masses, but we have to live with common parlance.
We should probably, once we're exposed to these words of precision, we should probably try and adopt them, especially if you've got young children or other people you're responsible for forming, just because, well, one of the reasons we're having these conversations is confusion, right? And words matter. So I appreciate your precision on that. But if we accept that the Missa Cantata is in fact a low mass, I'm not going to let you slide on the incense thing. So you said with no incense, and yet.
Okay, so yes, as originally envisioned, it was very explicit. There will be no incense used because there were no ministers, and it was a lower, ceremonially, it was lower on the totem pole. So in fact, originally, this was started mid 1700s. All right, it was explicit. Incense is explicitly prohibited, but it was done anyways. All right? So, and it wasn't abuse. Well, you know how it goes with abuses, right? It was widespread, and so it became tolerated. Tolerated is a very particular canonical term. It basically means when people are doing something that they shouldn't, but there's no possibility to stop it, we're just going to let it go. And I'm going to give you a very common example of that. During the Mass, you're not supposed to sing hymns in the vernacular, but we do in the low Mass, even though we shouldn't. And so the church says, just turns a blind eye to it and tolerate the singing of hymns during Mass. Keep in mind, the processional and the recessional actually do not happen within the Mass. So we're talking about the offertory hymn and the communion hymn should not be in the vernacular. And most people do not do that in a Missa Cantata. Some do. They're not, strictly speaking, wrong. It's prohibited but tolerated, right? And then in a low Mass, people just do that. I don't. When we pick the hymns at our chapel at St. Anthony's, we do not do vernacular hymns during any Mass, no offertory, nor at communion. We do Latin, strictly speaking. So that was from about 1750 until finally it became explicitly allowed to use incense during the Missa Cantata in 1960, if you can imagine.
This distinction that you've made, I think, is actually a great opportunity for people to understand, practically speaking, how this can work well. If you have those Latin hymns or chants within the liturgy, it's an opportunity to work on your Latin and to become familiar with chants or Latin hymns that every Catholic should know. And then we have these bookends outside of the liturgy, the processional and recession hymns, which are in the vernacular you're probably familiar with, that make it easy for everybody to sing along. So there is a little bit of a balance that's developed there in this situation we find ourselves in, where most of the Masses are not ideal, so to speak. Is that fair?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, so sticking with this incense question, is every Mass that a bishop says, is it sung and is it with incense? That seems impossible. It
is not practical. In fact, it's not. So when we talk about a Missa Pontificalis, a pontifical Mass, if we don't specify, it's fair to presume we mean a solemn pontifical Mass. Incense, sung, ministers. But there is such a thing as a pontifical low Mass, and that's when a bishop says something that's very, very similar to the low Mass of a priest. It has some additional ceremonies, but it has the very important characteristic of having sacred ministers. So it's not sung and there's no incense, but it does have sacred ministers and has a slightly higher level of ceremony.
And wasn't there, a little bit off the subject here, but wasn't there some recent restriction placed? Did the Vatican not restrict pontifical low masses for some reason. Do you recall seeing that?
It was, and who knows what the rationale is for what takes place in the contemporary church. I mean, there have been severe restrictions placed on the traditional Latin Mass as well. So I'm aware of it. I haven't looked deeply into it, but I can't explain it.
Yeah, it's an odd restriction. All right, now you've spent your entire life in and around the priestly fraternity of the Society of St. Pius X. And globally, that's where probably most people are going to experience their traditional masses. Here in the United States, it's a little bit different. There's a lot of diocesan masses. You've got the fraternity and the institute, and maybe a few smaller ones. But when the faithful of the society attend Mass, what should they be expecting?
It's probably true of all of where the traditional Latin Mass is offered, but if we consider the general case or the particular case of the society, none of us should expect that Pope Francis is going to be saying a Missa Papalis for us. For a pontifical Mass, you need a bishop. Within the Society of St. Pius X, there aren't a lot of bishops, and by and large, bishops have not made themselves available to say the Pontifical Mass. But even when there is a bishop, you need two other men who are ordained, either as a priest or as a deacon, to assist the bishop as sacred ministers. So, given that there's a dearth of bishops and a dearth of priests, certainly within the society, priests from the priories are generally off saying Mass in the mission chapels. So even if the bishop shows up, special arrangements typically have to be made to ensure that that you're also going to have two other ordained men there to assist the bishop. Now, that said, you will always see a Missa Pontificalis, a pontifical Mass at confirmations or at the ordinations, and you'll probably see them at confirmations. Confirmations are enough of a big deal. The bishop goes there, and usually they'll figure out a way to get a priest and deacon, two deacons to assist the bishop. But very few of us get to experience regularly what is the normative Mass, the Missa Pontificalis. In bygone days, this was something that you could witness every Sunday, and you were in the cathedral.
Is it so? Here's off on another tangent. Can a bishop be one of those solemn ministers? Can he serve?
Certainly. He just must be ordained. So it's at least, in fact, when the Pope would say a Missa Papalis, it was common enough for the ministers to be, in fact, cardinal archbishops, cardinal bishops, and bishops and priests. Absolutely, sure.
And there's a neat story. I'm sure one of the viewers will point it out if I'm wrong, but isn't there a neat story about a new priest in Rome went to serve his Mass, and the altar server didn't show up, and there was the Pope kneeling in front of an altar praying privately, and he noticed the commotion. He went over there and volunteered to
serve Mass.
Yeah, kind of.
I love it. Yes, I love it.
I don't remember who that Pope is, but somebody will find that.
Somebody will tell us
that story and correct me, I'm sure. Okay, so if we consider the Missa Solemnis as the norm in the church for the traditional Mass, why aren't we seeing more of them?
So the distinction being, as distinct from Missa Pontificalis, you have a priest instead of a bishop, but you still need three ordained men, and there is a shortage of priests from the priories within the Society of St. Pius X. Priests are often enough out at the mission chapels, people who are grateful to get a priest one Sunday a month, and so it just doesn't happen often enough that you're going to get out at the mission chapels that you're ever get three priests or a priest and two priests and a deacon, or priests and two deacons to have a Missa. Certainly not a Missa Pontificalis nor a Missa Solemnis. at a mission chapel.
And I would think this is the same situation if people are attending a mass in a diocese or a fraternity. There just aren't those sacred ministers just hanging around.
Right. They're out saying masses in remote parishes. Our priests are leaving the priories to go say mass in the mission chapels. So even at the priories, you still need one priest and 2 ordained men. Well, the deacons are all up at St. Thomas Aquinas. The priests are out saying mass at the mission chapels. So typically they'll leave 1 or 2 priests behind at the priories to say the mass or masses there, but it's just not often that you're going to have 3 priests in the same place at the same time to sing a Missa Solemnis. So you'll seldom see that at the missions or at the priories.
What are the occasions in which we could expect to see a solemn? Or whether it's Pontificalis or a Solemnis.
Solemnis.
When would we see that? Yeah.
The most likely occasion, apart from ordinations, would be confirmations or some other important event. If the bishop comes in to dedicate the church, you'll almost certainly have a Missa Solemnis or Missa Pontificalis. Missa Solemnis for other important events. A lot of times, believe it or not, we've had them at our chapel when it just happened that a priest from our chapel was home visiting his family. At the same time, one of his friends from seminary was there. And so we had enough priests. And so we had a Missa Solemnis.
Very nice.
Happenstance.
So for our purposes, can we simplify the terminology? Because I can imagine for the regular layman.
Let's boil it all down.
Yes.
Certainly. But the first thing to do is we have to remove some ambiguity. So high mass is ambiguous, and it's even incorrect when it's applied to a sung mass, but we're not going to win that battle. Jeff, you and I are not going to fix that. All right. So we shouldn't try, but probably we do well to not use the term high mass, especially since we have a better term. And so let's don't. And no one uses the term missa lecta or red mass. So we can probably drop that from our lexicon also and just say low mass. Now, from the point of view of the faithful and what they do at mass, there's really not much of a difference between there's essentially no difference for the faithful between a pontifical mass and a solemn mass. Similarly, from the point of view of the faithful and what they do at mass, there's very little difference between what happens at a solemn mass and what happens at a sung mass. So in terms of describing for the faithful what gets done at mass, it's adequate to just refer to low mass, which is pretty unambiguous, even though a sung mass is strictly a low mass. Talk in terms of low mass and then sung mass, because in terms of what the faithful do, it's practically indistinguishable from a solemn mass. So we can talk about low mass versus solemn mass or low mass versus sung mass, pretty much the same difference. If we treat of those two, we'll cover the waterfront.
And I know in the future, we've got some variations within those masses that we're going to talk about further. So we can say low mass and sung mass, and everybody's going to understand what we're talking about.
Right.
And I think that's a good place for us to talk about what we'll do on the next episode. We're going to look at what the faithful do as it regards standing, sitting, and kneeling at those two masses, because there are some differences. And we'll make the necessary distinctions between low mass and sung mass, and a few more distinctions for the solemn mass. And then I know we've got something on our list here, an important distinction for a pontifical mass, regardless of whether or not it's low or solemn.
Right.
Anything else you want to wrap up with today?
I think that's good for a day. Terminology matters. People say, well, it's just semantics, but semantics is about what words mean, and meaning is a very important part of what it is that makes us rational creatures. And so, yes, semantics is important, meaning is important, and it's important to make these distinctions so that when we communicate, we can actually communicate with some level of comprehension.
Well, and precision is important in all other aspects of our life, right? If you're a homemaker and you're following a recipe, you use exactly what's specified, right? If you wing it, sometimes the results aren't always what you'd hope
No,
for.
no, exactly what you wanted.
Yeah. Okay, Jim, thank you for being with us again today for this episode of Welcome to Tradition, and thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, Jeff. God bless you.
God bless you.